In the summer of 1348, the Black Death arrived in England. It came through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset in June of that year, carried in the bodies of sailors who had already been dying for weeks before their ship touched the English shore. By the autumn of 1348, it had reached London. By 1349, it was in every county of England, in every market town and river crossing and cathedral city and isolated hamlet on the edge of the moors. It killed between a third and a half of England's population. Some regions lost more. The village of Eyam in Derbyshire would later, during the 1665 plague, lose three-quarters of its population in a single year in an act of deliberate self-quarantine. In the Black Death of 1348 and 1349, specific villages simply stopped existing. The people died. The buildings stood empty. The fields that had been plowed by the same families for 6 and 8 and 10 generations grew over. What the Black Death revealed about England's medieval population is something that the historical record has been slowly making visible for the past half-century of genetic research. The people who died did not leave descendants. The people who survived did, and because survival in a pandemic that killed between a third and a half of the population was not random, because it depended on specific genetic factors that we now understand better than the people living through the plague could have. The survivors' descendants carry specific markers in their DNA that reflect a specific genetic advantage that allowed their ancestors to be in the living half rather than the dead half. This video is about one of those survivors. Not a king, not a bishop, not a merchant or a soldier or a scholar whose name appears in a document with a wax seal on it. A peasant, a specific kind of medieval English peasant who was sitting on the same 12 acres of ground in the same Midlands village in 1348 as his grandfather had sat on in 1298, who watched the plague come through his community and watched specific neighbors die and did not die himself, and whose specific decision about how to live and where to live and who to have children with produced a line of descent that 400 million people alive today can trace to the specific DNA markers that man left behind. Are you one of them? Subscribe before we start. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Before the peasant, the world he lived in, because understanding what made this specific medieval peasant's survival significant requires understanding what medieval peasant life actually was in the decades before the Black Death arrived to change everything. England in 1300 was a country of approximately 4 to 6 million people, the highest population the island had supported in recorded history. The growth had happened across the 12th and 13th centuries, driven by a specific combination of agricultural improvements, expanded cultivation, and a climate period known to medieval climate historians as the medieval warm period that had lasted from approximately 950 to 1250 and had made northern European agriculture significantly more productive than it had been in the early medieval period. The people who carried that growth were not the nobility whose names fill the history books. The people who carried it were the villeins and the serfs and the cotters and the boarders, the specific categories of unfree peasantry that the English manorial system classified in the Domesday Book of 1086, and that the following 2.5 centuries had organized into the specific agricultural communities that covered the English Midlands and East Anglia and the river valleys of the southern counties. A villein in 1300 was a person of a specific legal status, not a slave, not a free man, something in between that the medieval English legal system had developed specific words and specific legal categories for. A villein owed labor services to the lord of the manor on whose land he lived. He could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. He could not sue in the royal courts for most purposes. His children were bound to the same legal status as their parents. And in exchange for all of this, he had something that the peasants of many other European countries did not reliably have: access to a specific strip of land. A house plot and agricultural strips in the common field system that was the primary agricultural organization of the English medieval countryside land that the villain's family had worked in many cases for generations, and that the manorial court system provided a specific legal protection for even within the unfree status of the villanage. This is the world that the peasant in this video was born into. Specific land, specific legal status, specific community. The same 12 acres his grandfather had, the same annual round of plowing and sowing and harvesting that the common field system organized, the same lord, the same church, the same neighbors, and then, in the summer of 1348, everything changed. The plague and the choice. The Black Death that reached England in 1348 was the bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas living on black rats, and transmitted to humans through flea bites or through the pneumonic form of the disease that spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. The medieval world did not know any of this. What they knew was that people developed swellings in the groin and armpits and neck, that they developed fever and blackening of the skin from subcutaneous bleeding, and that they died, in most cases within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. The mortality rate of the untreated bubonic plague is approximately 30 to 60%. The pneumonic form, where the infection spreads to the lungs and is transmitted through the air, has a mortality rate approaching 100%. Without treatment, in 1348 there was no treatment. There was bleeding and herbal remedies and prayer, and the specific medieval medical understanding of disease as a disturbance of the humors that the plague symptoms did not fit into any existing diagnostic category. What medieval people could observe was that the plague moved through communities in patterns they did not always understand. It killed some households untouched. It killed strong young men as readily as it killed the elderly. It killed priests, who administered last rites and sometimes spared the gravediggers who handled the bodies. The apparent randomness of survival in a community experiencing the Black Death was in fact not random. It was the specific result of 3 factors that we now understand and that the medieval survivors could only observe without fully comprehending. The first factor was genetic. Specific variants of human immune system genes, particularly variants of the CCR5 gene that codes for a protein involved in the immune response to infection, provided measurably enhanced resistance to the bubonic plague. The CCR5 delta 32 variant, which in its homozygous form provides substantial resistance to specific infections including the plague, is significantly more common in Northern European populations than in Southern European or African or Asian populations. And the research literature has proposed that this distribution reflects selection pressure from historical plague epidemics in Northern Europe, specifically from the Black Death of 1347 to 1351 and its subsequent recurrences. The second factor was geographic. The plague moved through population concentrations first. Towns and cities died faster and harder than isolated villages. Market days and fairs and religious gatherings accelerated the spread. Communities that had less contact with the main trade routes and less traffic through their boundaries experienced the plague later and sometimes less severely. A peasant who lived in a relatively isolated rural community who had less exposure to the main vectors of transmission than a merchant in a market town was statistically more likely to be exposed later in the epidemic's progression, when the initial explosive mortality had already removed many of the most infectious individuals. The third factor was behavioral. Some medieval communities made specific decisions about contact with the outside world when the plague began to spread. The Eyam quarantine of 1665 is the most famous documented example, but the historical record contains other accounts of communities that restricted their contact with outsiders during plague outbreaks with measurable effects on their mortality. In 1348, these decisions were made without any understanding of germ theory. They were made on the basis of observation, the visible association between contact with the sick and subsequent illness, that the practical intelligence of specific community leaders or specific families could translate into survival behavior even without the theoretical framework that would have explained why it worked. The specific survivor, the peasant in this video, survived the Black Death of 1348 and 1349. He survived in the English Midlands, in the specific landscape of the open field villages that covered the clay vales of Leicestershire and Northamptonshire and Warwickshire in that period. He was a villain on a manor. He had a surname, or something functioning as a surname, because the English peasantry had been acquiring hereditary surnames across the 13th and 14th centuries as the administrative system of the manorial courts required more specific identification of individuals than the single personal name plus father's name system of the early medieval period had provided. The surname he carried was an occupational name or a topographical name or a nickname, one of the four primary categories from which English hereditary surnames developed in the 13th and 14th centuries. Occupational names, the largest category, derived from the work a man did: smith, miller, cooper, baker, thatcher, weaver. Names that began as descriptions and became hereditary across the generation that coincided with the Black Death. A man called Thomas the Smith, whose son was also called Thomas and who worked the same forge, became Thomas Smith, and his son became Robert Smith. And the name stuck. The Black Death created a specific pressure on this naming system. When a third to a half of a community died, the administrative record that had tracked which Thomas stopped working because too many of the Thomases who had defined each other by contrast were gone. The survivors and the manorial court rolls of the post-plague period show a specific pattern in the English historical record. Names that had been common before 1348, names like John and William and Richard and Thomas and Robert at the top of the male name frequency list, became even more concentrated in the surviving population because the specific individuals who had carried those names and had died in the plague were replaced in the documentary record by the survivors who now needed to be distinguished by their additional surname in ways that the pre-plague administrative system had sometimes managed without. The peasant in this video had children after the plague. This is the specific decision that matters for the 400 million figure in this video's title. Not that he survived. Survival alone produces no descendants. What produces 400 million descendants across 670 years is that he survived and then had children. Specifically, more than 2 surviving children who themselves survived to have children, creating the exponential multiplication that population genetics uses to calculate the numbers of descendants that any medieval ancestor can produce across a sufficient number of generations. The mathematics of medieval genealogy are counterintuitive. A single individual alive in 1349 who had 2 surviving children, who each had 2 surviving children, repeating this pattern across every generation to the present would produce a theoretical line of descent visible in millions of contemporary Europeans. The actual figure for a medieval English peasant who survived the Black Death and had a normal family is not millions but potentially hundreds of millions, because the specific reproductive advantage of being in the surviving half of the post-plague population created a demographic expansion whose effects are still visible in the population genetics of contemporary Britain and Northern Europe. What the CCR5 Delta 32 variant means. The CCR5 Delta 32 genetic variant that provides resistance to specific infections is present in approximately 10 to 15% of the Northern European population. In individuals who carry 2 copies of the variant, one from each parent, the resistance is substantially enhanced. In individuals who carry 1 copy, the protection is partial but measurably present. The distribution of this variant in European populations is not geographically uniform. It is most common in Northern and Eastern European populations, specifically in Scandinavian and Finnish populations, where it reaches its highest frequencies, and it decreases in frequency moving south and east through Europe. The pattern matches what population geneticists would predict if the variant had been subject to positive selection pressure from historical plague epidemics concentrated in the Northern European population centers. The research literature is not unanimous on this interpretation. Some researchers have proposed that the CCR5 Delta 32 variant was already present in the Northern European population before the Black Death, and that its frequency reflects other selection pressures, predating the plague. Others have proposed that the variant's protective effect against the plague was the primary driver of its current frequency distribution. The most recent genetic studies using ancient DNA from pre-plague and post-plague burial populations have found that the variant's frequency increased significantly in the post-plague period, a finding that supports the plague selection hypothesis. What this means for a contemporary person who takes a DNA test and finds Northern European ancestry is that a portion of the ancestry they carry from medieval England or Scandinavia or the Low Countries includes the specific genetic contribution of people who survived the Black Death in part because of genetic variants that their descendants have inherited. The specific peasant who survived in the English Midlands in 1349 was, in the genetic sense, already predisposed to survival by the variants he carried in his immune system genes, variants that he passed to his children and his grandchildren, and that are now distributed across the hundreds of millions of people who descend from the survivors of the medieval European plague. The manorial court rolls of the English Midlands counties are among the most completely preserved medieval administrative records in the world. The lords of English manors maintained detailed records of the proceedings of their manorial courts, the courts that handled the legal affairs of the villein population, because those records were the primary documentation of the lord's rights over his unfree tenants. Land transfers, inheritance claims, labor obligations, fines for various infractions of the manorial custom, all of these were recorded in the manorial court rolls with a regularity and a completeness that reflects the economic importance of the records to the Lord. Subscribe right now because the next section covers the specific manorial records that document the post-plague population in the English Midlands counties. The specific surnames that appear in those records in the generation immediately following the Black Death, and the specific research tools that a contemporary person can use to search those records for the surnames that connect their family to the medieval peasant population of post-plague England. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. The manorial court rolls from the period immediately following the Black Death show a specific documentary signature. The records from the 1347 and 1348 terms, the years before the plague reached specific communities, show the normal pattern of manorial court activity: land transfers, minor disputes, labor obligations. Then the records from 1349 show something different. Entry after entry recording the death of the tenant and the inheritance of the tenant's land by whoever had survived in the family, or in the cases where entire families had died, the lord's resumption of the land into his own hands, because there was nobody left to inherit. The Huntingdonshire manual records, the Leicestershire records, the East Anglian records all show the same signature. A community that was tracking dozens of tenants before 1348 is tracking half that number or fewer in 1349. The surviving tenants, suddenly with access to land that the dead had vacated, found themselves in a position that their grandfathers could not have anticipated. Labor was scarce. Land was available. The lords who had previously held absolute power over their villein population found themselves in the specific position of needing to attract and retain surviving laborers in ways that the pre-plague manorial economy had not required. The post-plague peasant was, in a specific economic sense, more valuable than the pre-plague peasant had been. Not because anyone was acknowledging his worth as a human being in terms that the 14th century feudal system would have recognized, but because the specific economic reality of a labor market in which the labor supply had been cut in half by the plague gave the surviving peasant leverage that the unfree legal status of villeinage had previously prevented him from exercising. This is the specific economic context in which the peasant, whose descendants number 400 million, raised his children in the decades following the Black Death. He was in a position that the survivors of the plague occupied collectively, a position of unintended advantage in a decimated labor market, and the decisions he made about how to use that advantage, which lord to work for, which land to settle on, which community to build a life in, are the decisions that shape the specific line of descent that leads to the contemporary population, whose DNA the genetic research is now tracing back to the post-plague survivor generation. The English surname and the 400 million contemporary descendants of a single medieval English peasant is not a speculation. It is the result of applying the specific mathematics of genealogical descent to the documented demographic history of the English-speaking world across the past 6 centuries. A single medieval English person who had 2 children who survived to reproductive age in a period when the average family size was larger than 2 surviving children in most documented populations would have descendants numbering in the hundreds by the year 1500. By 1600, in the tens of thousands. By 1800s, in the hundreds of thousands. By 1900s, in the millions. By 2024, in the hundreds of millions. The English-speaking diaspora created by the colonization of North America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa between the 17th and 19th centuries means that the descendants of medieval English peasants are not confined to England. They are in every country where English speakers settled. Every American of primarily English or British ancestry is a descendant of the medieval English peasant population. Every Australian of British ancestry. Every South African of British ancestry to the contemporary Anglophone world is not a fraction. It is the majority of the genetic ancestry of every person in that world who traces the British Isles component of their ancestry to the pre-modern period. The Black Death survivors are not a specific identifiable subset of that ancestry that modern genetic testing can cleanly separate from the Black Death fatalities' theoretical descendants. But the CC or 5 delta 32 variant distribution across contemporary Northern European populations is the closest available proxy for the genetic legacy of the Black Death survival selection. A contemporary person with Northern European ancestry who carries 1 or 2 copies of the CC or 5 delta 32 variant is statistically more likely to be descended from a Black Death survivor than a contemporary person who carries no copies of the variant. This is not proof. Population genetics does not work through individual proof, but through statistical probability distributions across populations. What it means practically is that if you are of primarily British or Northern European ancestry, you are almost certainly descended from multiple individuals who survived the Black Death of 1347 to 1351. Including individuals who survived because of specific genetic variants they carried in their immune system genes, and that they passed to you through the unbroken line of descent that connects you to the English Midlands of 1349. The medieval peasant who survived did not know he was doing something historically significant. He was doing what survivors of catastrophes do. He was getting up the next morning. He was plowing the field that the dead neighbor no longer needed to plow. He was building a life in the space that the plague had opened up. And he was having children, because having children is what people who have survived a catastrophe that killed half the people around them do, and because the children he had were the beginning of the 400 million that his survival made possible. The village that remembered, in the English Midlands county of Leicestershire, in the Clay Vale country south of the Soar River, there are villages that have existed under the same name since the Domesday Book of 1086 recorded their populations and their landholdings for William the Conqueror's tax assessment. Not every village in that record survived. Some of the Domesday settlements are now fields, places where the earthwork outlines of medieval house platforms and street patterns are visible from the air in dry summers when the soil over the buried medieval features holds less moisture than the surrounding plowland. These are the lost villages, the communities that the Black Death or the subsequent economic changes of the 14th and 15th centuries removed from the map so completely that their names survive only in the field names of the farms that now cover them. The villages that survived are the communities where enough people lived through the plague to maintain the social and agricultural organization that the manorial system required. A manor needed a minimum viable population to function. It needed people to plow and sow and harvest and pay the annual dues and appear at the manorial court 3 times a year. When a community fell below that minimum, when the plague had killed enough people that the survivors could not maintain the agricultural round on their own, the manor collapsed. The Lord enclosed the common fields for sheep pasture, which required far less labor than arable farming, and the survivors dispersed into neighboring communities. The village that remembered is the village that maintained its population above that minimum. It kept its church, it kept its court, it kept its records, and it kept the surnames of the families that had survived. Surnames that appear in the manorial court rolls of the generation after the plague, and that are still carried by families today who have no idea that the name connects them to a community that made it through the worst demographic catastrophe in recorded European history. The Midlands manorial records for the post-plague generation show specific surnames appearing for the first time in the documented record of their communities in the years between 1350 and 1380. Names that were carried by individuals who had survived the plague and whose presence in the community after the plague was the beginning of a continuous documentary record that runs from the 14th century to the present. These are the names in the National Archives. These are the names that the contemporary genealogical researcher finds when they follow an English family line back past the parish records of the 16th century and into the manorial record of the 14th. The specific mechanics of following an English family line into the medieval manorial record require two things that most contemporary genealogical researchers have not needed to develop: the ability to read medieval Latin, because the manorial court rolls were recorded in Latin until 1733, when an Act of Parliament required English to be used in legal records, and the specific archival knowledge of which collections and which repositories cover which manors in which counties, because the manorial record is not organized by surname or by family, but by manor. And finding a specific family requires first knowing which manor they were on. Both of these barriers have been substantially lowered in the past decade by the digitization and translation work that the National Archives and the county record offices and the specific volunteer organizations dedicated to medieval record transcription have been doing. The PSA database, the prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England, covers the pre-conquest period. The IPM database, the Inquisition's post-mortem, covers the deaths of landholders from the late 13th century onward, and the Manorial Document Register at the National Archives indexes the holdings of manorial records across England, providing the specific starting point for any researcher who knows the county and is willing to begin the search. The peasant who survived the Black Death left a record in one of those collections, not a record of his survival, because medieval manorial records do not record the fact of survival. They record the fact of continued presence, the appearance at the manorial court, the payment of the annual dues, the transfer of land to a son or daughter. The record of survival is the record of continued presence, and for the medieval English peasant, continued presence in the manorial record after 1349 is the documentary equivalent of saying, "I was here before the plague, and I am still here after it." The records that document the medieval English peasant population are accessible to anyone willing to look for them. The National Archives at Kew holds the major manorial court roll collections from the English Midlands counties. The specific collections for Leicestershire, Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, and Huntingdonshire are among the most completely preserved. The record series SC2, the special collection series covering manorial records, is the primary archive for this research and has been partially digitized and indexed. The surname record of the English medieval peasantry that the manorial court rolls preserve is the specific documentary connection between the contemporary person searching for medieval ancestry and the specific community that the Black Death survivors built in the post-plague English countryside. A surname that appears in the Leicestershire manorial court rolls of the 1350s and 1360s. In the generation immediately following the Black Death is a surname whose carrier had survived the plague and whose family was beginning the reproductive recovery that would produce the hundreds of millions of contemporary descendants that the mathematics of genealogical descent makes inevitable. Find the surname, find the county. Search the manorial record. The peasant who outsmarted the Black Death is in those records. The connection between him and the contemporary person looking for him is 675 years of unbroken descent, most of it undocumented, all of it real. Subscribe if this video gave you something worth looking for. Every week on this channel, we go this deep into the populations that the standard history overlooks and the DNA is now finding. Subscribe, like this video, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment below with the English county your medieval ancestry traces to. Because the manorial records for that county are in the National Archives, and the surnames in those records are the surnames of the people who survived.